Because it was sunny, because it was warm, because of greed, because they could, because the soil was so fertile, because the scale of the continent so vast, because the plant life was cloaked in mystery, the sweep of its jungles so borderless, the rise of its mountains so touching of God's knuckles, because the rivers were so ovarian, the land studded with treasures innumerable, because the people were primitive in weaponry and for years had suffered defeat, because of massacres the blood ran deep. Because the Portuguese were losing their grip on the Congo territory, and the French, Spanish, and German had stakes in the rich promise of its fields. Because, like an omen of what was to come, the Portuguese glimpsed the illicit silhouette of German efficiency. They begged for a conference. Because they ignored the expansive diversity of indigenous Africans, the dark, swan-like features of the Fulani, the ox-muscled Wolof, the clicking-tongued Xhosa people, the mountain-dwelling Moroccans, the brown-skinned Bantu, down to the Jewish Ethiopians and 3,000 other tribes migrating through the limitless land, the continent was chopped into just 50 states. 50. Because suddenly there were borders, the tribes warred amongst each other. Because the northern tribes refused British rule and took arms against their colonizers, the generals had rebels to subdue. Because most soldiers care little for words, the land was poorly named. Because she'd written about it for years, the journalist Fiona Shaw thought Nigeria would do. Because Obi's wife was from a different tribe, the marriage hadn't gone down well in the village. Because Obi was a peace-loving man, he didn't quarrel when she died, accepted what the midwife said. Because their son survived, Obi thought he'd be fine. Because when he looked in his son's eyes and some difference flickered, he thought his son was cursed by his mother's tribe, so ostracized his son. Because the mother-in-law was a witch woman, she was used to such foolish talk. Because Obi was a practical man, he called his son Obi. Because the difference was needed, Obi Jr. was his name. Because of variations, JROB was sometimes used, but because of nickname culture, Jareau would do. Jareau grew close to his grandmother because his mother wasn't around. And talk spread like wind through households because his eyes were light as sand and not the earth brown of soil that paved the forest ground. And each blamed the grandmother because her secret ways were strange. Because the secret was she listened and rarely spoke a word. The people folded up their gossip when she passed by, forest bound, and Jareau repeated what they said when they reached the forest ground. Because Jareau asked what the witch woman did, she spat her chewing stick, began heaving rapidly. Jareau ran to fetch her water, thinking something had blocked her throat, but as he turned, it changed to laughter, water streaming down her face. Because she drew Jareau near, but hadn't answered his question, Jareau struggled in a grip because Jareau could taste his fear. Simply put, grandmother said, Jareau, listening is good. The world will tell you all its dangers if you listen to the brook, the running river, the falling skies, the white man's laughter, their marching boots. All I know of leaf and fiber, bark, stem, nuts, root. I know because people tell me. I put their stories to good use. I know more than my own mother. Jareau, this is what we do. Because she had answered his question, Jareau sat on a fallen trunk and watched his grandmother work, collecting roots, gathering fruits, quiet as she did, because this is what they do. Because they heard the sound, Jareau was startled as he watched. And when grandmother turned around, she only saw clouds of dust because Jareau was off and running, speeding, dodging the low branches to the heart of the village where he thought he'd find the sound. Because the village was close to the coastal city of Lagos, Jareau was used to soldiers marching past. Because of the perfect timing of their boots, the same strong song grandmother listened to, Jareau could sleep easily into the hypnotic of their rhythm. Because he'd watched so often, the commanders recognized the small strong boy with sand brown eyes. Because Jareau was taught to fear these British commanders, ruthless white men, he'd always hide till the coast was clear. Because the commander smiled, Jareau waved in response, then crept out of his hiding to trace the sound he sought. Because he found a bugle player blowing as he walked, and Jareau slowed to march beside him, miming the bugler's strut, Jareau saw what came after. It froze him to the earth. When grandmother reached the soldier somewhere holding Jareau down because he was kicking helmets, shouting curses, kicking shins, and biting hands, crying with an anger that scorched the village ground, she took over, held him down, and asked Jareau the problem. Unable to speak, Jareau gestured with his hand. The year was 1906. Because the British couldn't defeat the rebels on their own, they'd begun recruiting Nigerians. Because not enough joined, citing the traitorous nature of such a thing, the enlisting officers tasked the local chiefs to get their men however they could. Because Obi had been walking home alone, he was chained up by thugs, cast among a lot of men, and delivered to the battalions marching past. Because the bugler's tune drowned Jareau's cries, Obi kept walking, his back straight, head high, and stifled the tremble that threatened down his spine. Because despite the tribal difference, Jareau was still his son. The bugler's tune was the Hausa farewell, which Jareau called the long song goodbye, for it was only played when the soldiers left. Jareau watched them disappear down the road, out of sight. Because grandmother was livid, she went to find the chiefs. Dusk had fallen on the village, families gathered pounding yams, thick soups boiled, mingling with the gossip of what had just happened, which men had just vanished. Because she marched past, fury in each step, they fell in line behind her. She hadn't stopped to rest. Because the guards knew about her, they didn't dare block her path. "Explain to me what happened." The chief spoke. The folks gasped. Because it was late when she returned, grandmother tried to creep. Because he had been waiting, his questions came out fast. Because she sat down heavily, Jareau paused before he asked. Because the army camp was close, Jareau calmed down. Because she was still talking, Jareau sat by her feet and learned that there were battles over trade and territory, and soon Obi would travel to those battlefields. Because she wasn't sure when Jareau asked if he'd be safe, Jareau decided he too would join the war. He was 12 years old. He'd have to wait for years. By then, grandmother thought, the battles would be done. Obi had joined the 2nd Battalion, Southern Regiment, West African Frontier Force. Because the Africans were used as human mules to carry artillery across the rough terrain, Obi thought he'd simply die of fatigue and malnutrition because the land was treacherous, the hours long, the weight unbearable, the food insufficient. For decades leading up, Europe was plunged in conflict. Serbia and the Allies had formed the Balkan League and fought the Ottoman Empire, effectively destroying it. The spoils of war included unclaimed land, and Austria-Hungary wanted a piece of it. Because the Serbians wanted that same piece, there were tensions between both kings. Because a Serbian assassin killed Austria-Hungary's prince, a battle commenced of which the world had never seen. The year was 1914. Russia was Serbian allies, Germany, Austria-Hungary's. Because the Russians mobilized their forces, the Germans declared war. Because the French were Russian allies, Germany declared war and invaded Belgium to outflank the French. Because Belgium were neutral, Britain declared war, and the Balkan League countries attacked the German force for what they felt was unprovoked war. Because the Europeans had colonized Africa, their grudges jumped oceans and landed intact months before the Serbians killed the young prince. In fact, the first shots fired in the war were between British and Germans on African soil. Because it was never explained, all Obi knew was that an order came through, his battalion shipped out. Because Jareau was watching that fateful morning, he saw them board ships and sail towards the south. Because she couldn't stop him, Jareau packed his few belongings and strode out to the enlisting soldier's office. Because grandmother whispered, "Listen to the world," Jareau paused, saluted, and acknowledged who he loved. Months later, grandmother's eyes were dry as the bugler played again the long song goodbye. When Jareau reached Battlefront West Africa, Kamina, a town in Togoland, the fields were silent because the battle was done. Because the German-owned lands were bordered by the Allies, they invaded and defeated the Germans in 3 weeks. They passed burned villages, trains upturned, bridges destroyed, forests on fire. Because African bodies lay scattered in the fields, Jareau, as a carrier, was asked to burn these lumps of flesh, men who looked like him. As Jareau did this, he looked for Obi. He looked for his father. He couldn't find him. Because he asked where survivors went, he learned the next battle would happen further south in Cameroon, a German territory. Because the conflict deepened and Germans didn't retreat. Because the trenches were tough, uniforms inadequate, because the Europeans succumbed easily to the particular baking of African heat, because of rapidly spreading disease, a suggestion was made, let the Africans fight, because it made sense. But a general replied, if a colored man was trained to raise arms against another European, what guarantee was there that he would not one day attack his white master? Let's think about this. Because the French hadn't shared those thoughts, they'd long since trained a black force. La Force Noire was what General Mangin called the Senegalese soldiers in the First World War. To him, West Africans were natural warriors, primitives with blood keen to be shed, with poor nervous systems and death in their genes. If ordered, they could sleep amidst battle. They demolished the enemy in German West Africa, but still there were battles raging in the east. Because the British eventually let them fight, Jareau got to taste what war really was, how such calamity made cousins of them all the various tribes united to defeat a common enemy, or who the British said they were. For though they were trained to fight and use guns, it was never explained why they battled, for what cause. After the Cameroon campaign was done, the Nigerian regiment traveled to the east. 4 battalions were formed of 4 companies each with 104 armed men, with Enfield rifles and mountain guns, 2,402 Nigerians, 195 British men, 812 machine guns, and Jareau was assigned one of them. They sailed around the coast of South Africa and disembarked at Dar es Salaam. But the battle in East Africa was a different beast because the Germans knew the territory well. Though the French and the British had 1 million carriers with 150,000 men, they couldn't defeat the German General von Lettow-Vorbeck. He was greatly feared because he perfected guerrilla warfare. With only 15,000 men, he'd appear like phantoms in the bush, attack and escape, vanish in thin air. Because the area was thrice the size of Germany, because it was mostly covered by bush, because the railways would melt in tropical sun, because the torrential rain made the soil impassable, because the land would turn from swamp to desert, because water was more precious than gold, because the soldiers died of malaria, because the insects would sting relentless, because lions would seize the carriers, because crocodiles would grab the men, because giraffes destroyed telegraph lines and hippos attacked the gunships, because rhinos charged the troops and bees put whole battalions to flight. Such was the battle in German East Africa. Such was the scale of human suffering. Because he'd learned to listen to the world, because he remembered grandmother's words, Jareau had a sixth sense during battle and saved many men who'd have died for the cause, from the enemy German African carriers to members of other tribes in his force. Further in the south, a battle raged on, and because the troops were under attack, Jareau's battalion were ordered a quick march to surprise the Germans and attack from the east. And this is how Jareau found Obi, a war-ravaged carrier, down on his knees, gasping from the bullet hole in his chest. Because Obi recognized his son, because he asked Jareau's forgiveness, because he said, "We are different, but we are one, and must unite after the white man's war. I've seen what can happen, who we can become." Because he died moments later, the sandy color left Jareau's eyes. Because Vorbeck didn't give up, the war raged for one more year. Because Jareau was fueled with vengeance, he fought with every ounce of strength. Because he'd met other Africans, his sense of self deepened to no end. He had met Black South Africans, Zambians, and the Congolese, Zimbabweans, Tunisians, Moroccans, and the Sudanese, Algerians, Kenyans, Ghanaians, and the Togolese, all fighting a baffling battle, a war between Europeans, of which they numbered the greater dead, in a sense, in these skirmishes. Because Vorbeck finally gave up, months after armistice, the last shots of World War I were fired where it started, on African soil. Because there were parades in the Western world, Nigerian soldiers asked if they could join. Because the British government refused them taking part, saying it'd be unwise to let colored soldiers march, Jareau never got to honor Obi, whose corpse he'd left out on those fields, carrying artillery. He couldn't bury him. Because Jareau returned to his home and told grandmother all that he'd seen, because Obi had been a peace-loving man, forced into battles well beyond him, because when Jareau finished his story, his sorrow had changed to a fist-clenched thing. Because the villagers gathered and listened, he spoke about Nigeria. He spoke about a future. He spoke about a nation. He spoke about a dream.